The negativity bias, why we focus on the bad and how to shift our perspective. Hey everyone, welcome to Older But Stronger, where we explore how to become ancestors worth remembering. I'm your host, Hans Hageman. Today we're tackling a psychological quirk that's probably ruined your mood more than once. I know it has mine. Negativity bias. Ever notice how a single criticism can ruin your day, even after receiving multiple compliments? It may have happened on your Facebook page or in your Facebook group. Or how that one embarrassing moment from years ago still haunts you while countless positive memories fade away. That's negativity bias at work. Our brain's tendency to prioritize, process, and remember negative experiences more readily than positive ones. In the next half hour, we'll explore why our brains evolved to focus on the negative, how this ancient survival mechanism impacts our modern lives, and most importantly, practical strategies to overcome this bias and build a more balanced perspective. Now, because becoming an ancestor worth remembering means learning to see both the challenges and the opportunities in front of us, just before we dive in, I'd like to share a quick story. Last week, I gave a presentation to about 50 people. Afterward, I received overwhelmingly positive feedback. People saying it changed their perspective, that they learned something valuable. But one person mentioned they couldn't hear me clearly because of the microphone or something. So, guess which comment kept me up that night? That's right, the single piece of criticism. Classic negativity bias. And I bet many of you can relate. So let's examine briefly the evolutionary basis of negativity bias. Let's start by understanding why our brains are wired this way. Negativity bias didn't develop to make us miserable, it evolved to keep us alive. Imagine our ancestors on the savannah. Which would be more costly, missing out on a delicious berry or failing to notice a predator? The answer is, or should be obvious. Those who paid extra attention to threats survived long enough to pass on their genes. We are literally the descendants of worriers. Psychologists Paul Rosen and Edward Roisman have documented this phenomenon extensively. They found that negative experiences imprint faster and more deeply than positive ones. It takes just one negative trait to label someone, quote, dangerous, but numerous positive traits to consider someone trustworthy. Evolutionarily, this makes perfect sense. Better safe than sorry. Dr. Rick Hansen, I got a bunch of his courses, he's a neuropsychologist, explains it beautifully when he says the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. Negative events stick, while positive ones slide away. This bias manifests across all areas of human psychology. In perception, we detect threatening facial expressions faster than friendly ones. In learning, painful lessons are acquired more quickly than rewarding ones. In memory, embarrassing moments persist while achievements fade. In decision making, potential losses loom larger than potential gains. The fascinating part is that negativity bias operates largely below conscious awareness, and conscious awareness is everything. It's not that we choose to focus on the negative; our brains do it automatically, a default setting installed by evolution. What's really interesting is how this affects us at different life stages. Children actually show less negativity bias than adults. They're more open to new experiences and quicker to forgive. As we age, we accumulate painful experiences that shape our perception. I'm down here in the Mississippi Delta acquiring a bunch of those. But here's the hopeful part: awareness is the first step toward change. Once we understand this bias exists, we can begin to counterbalance it. Let's talk about negativity bias in the digital age. Our ancient brains now operate in a thoroughly modern environment, one where threats aren't typically life or death, but our responses still act as if they are. And nothing exploits this vulnerability quite like our digital media landscape. Have you ever noticed how news headlines skew negative? If it bleeds, it leads isn't just a cynical saying. It's a business model based on our psychological wiring. A 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that each negative word in a news headline increased click through rates by approximately 2.3%. Media outlets aren't necessarily malicious. They're responding to what captures our attention. It's just makes good business sense. Social media, that takes it to another level. Platforms are designed to maximize engagement, and nothing drives engagement like outrage. A 2018 MIT study found that false news stories spread 6 times faster than true ones on Twitter X. Not because people prefer lies, but because misinformation typically triggers stronger emotional responses. Think about your own scrolling habits. When was the last time you stopped to engage with a post about something going well in the world? Particularly, just look at your feed now. Now compare that to how often you engage with content that makes you angry or anxious. Our feeds become curated by algorithms that learn what keeps us scrolling, and negativity often wins. This creates what is sometimes called a perception gap. We begin to believe the world is far more dangerous, divided, and dysfunctional than it actually is. The data tells a different story. We're in the enrichment age, I think it's called. Globally, extreme poverty has declined dramatically. Literacy rates are rising, and many diseases have been eradicated. But these slow, positive trends don't trigger our threat response, so they don't get our attention. It's worth adding that this doesn't just affect our mood, it impacts our collective decision making. When we perceive the world primarily through threats, we become more tribal, less creative, and less capable of nuanced thinking. Psychologists call this cognitive narrowing. Our perspective literally shrinks when we feel threatened. This explains why political discourse has become so polarized. We're all operating from a threat response much of the time. Now, let's talk about how negativity bias shapes our relationships. And I'm going to not try to give too many personal examples here for a variety of reasons. But anyway, perhaps nowhere is negativity bias more damaging than in our close relationships. Dr. John Gottman, one of the world's leading researchers on marriage and relationships, found something remarkable in his Love Lab studies. I like that name. It takes approximately 5 interactions to counterbalance a single negative one. Think about that ratio, 5 to 1. One critical comment requires 5 expressions of appreciation to maintain relationship balance. This explains why even generally happy couples can fall into negative spirals after conflicts. Negativity bias also explains why criticism often feels more personal than praise. When your partner compliments your cooking, you might think, oh, they're just being nice. But when they criticize it, you know that that has to be their true opinion. We tend to see negative feedback as more authentic than positive. This extends beyond romantic relationships. In parenting, many of us remember the times we lost patience more vividly than the countless moments of connection. At work, one piece of critical feedback in a performance review can overshadow a dozen positive comments. It's kind of why I like to do those kind of performance reviews differently. Now, it's not just unpleasant, it's costly. When we allow negativity bias to dominate our relationships, we miss opportunities for connection, growth, and joy. We become defensive instead of curious, protective instead of vulnerable. And there's also research suggesting that older adults, my hand is raised, actually show a positivity effect that counteracts some of this bias. As people age, they often become better at regulating emotions and focusing on positive aspects of relationships. Hand is still up. This suggests that with wisdom and practice, we can overcome some of these default settings. There are also health costs to chronic negativity. Living in a state of constant threat detection isn't just psychologically taxing, it takes a physical toll. When our brains perceive threats, they trigger the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones are helpful in true emergencies. They provide the energy to fight or flee. But when activated chronically, they become destructive. Chronic stress from persistent negativity has been linked to weakened immune function, increased inflammation, disrupted sleep patterns, higher blood pressure, accelerated cellular aging, and other things. Stanford psychologists Kelly McGonigal's research shows that it's not stress itself that damages health, it's how we perceive stress. When we view stressors as threats rather than challenges, our bodies respond differently at a physiological level. I'll talk about anti-fragility in another podcast. Negativity bias essentially keeps us in a low-grade threat mode much of the time. Each negative news story, social media post, or interpersonal conflict can trigger small stress responses that accumulate over time. This state of hypervigilance depletes our cognitive resources and physical resilience. Now, there's also good news, and that good news is that simple mindfulness practices can interrupt this cycle. Even brief periods of meditation or certain breathing activities, breath work. I'm a coach there, but holler at me. That activates the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest response, countering the effects of chronic stress. Let's talk about some other strategies to overcome negativity bias. Now, for the most important part, how do we work with this hardwired tendency? The goal isn't to ignore legitimate threats or become unrealistically positive. Other people would use the term toxically positive. Rather, it's to create a more balanced perspective, one that acknowledges both challenges and opportunities. Let's explore practical strategies that can help rewire our response patterns. So, one thing is to cultivate conscious awareness. The first step is simply noticing when negativity bias is operating. Call it out, give it a label. When you find yourself fixating on a criticism, a mistake, or a worry, pause and ask, is my threat detection system overreacting here? Just naming the bias can reduce its power. Try setting a negativity notice alarm on your phone a few times daily to check whether you're caught in negative thinking. Let's get that balance, adjusted. A second thing is to practice active savoring. Dr. Rick Hansen recommends taking in the good by deliberately savoring positive experiences. Notice the glimmers. When something pleasant happens, even something small like a moment of connection or a beautiful sunset, pause for 20 to 30 seconds to fully absorb the experience. Imagine it sinking into your body and memory. This helps positive experiences stick rather than slide away. You can also implement the 3-to-1 ratio. Remember Gottman's 5-1 relationship ratio? Well, we can apply a similar principle to our thought patterns. For every negative thought you notice, generate 3 positive or balanced thoughts. For instance, if you think, I made a mistake in that presentation, counter with, I prepared thoroughly, I recovered well, and I'll learn from this for next time. Another thing you can do is to curate your inputs. Be intentional about what you allow into your attention economy. Limit exposure to news and social media that triggers threat responses. Follow accounts that share solutions, not just problems. One approach that I've found helpful is the information sandwich. Like everything's a sandwich, right? But anyway, if you consume something negative, bookend it with positive or constructive content. Practice gratitude systematically. Gratitude isn't just a feel good exercise, it's a strategic intervention that counteracts negativity bias. Research from UC Davis shows that people who keep gratitude journals, I need to do it myself, I've done it, but anyway, it shows that there are measurable increases in well being and decreases in physical symptoms. Try writing down 3 specific things you're grateful for each night, focusing on different areas of your life. Another thing you can do is reframe threats as challenges. Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck's research on mindset shows that how we frame situations dramatically affects our response. When facing difficulties, try explicitly relabeling them. This isn't a threat, it's a challenge that can help me grow. This cognitive reframing activates different neural pathways and physiological responses. Next, figure out how to build community resilience. Negativity bias can be contagious, but so can balanced thinking. Be the person who gently redirects catastrophizing conversations toward constructive problem solving. Share positive news as readily as concerning news. Practice active hope, acknowledging problems while focusing on meaningful actions. And let me add one more technique that's been powerful in my work with clients. And that's taking the future self perspective, allowing people to see that. When caught in negativity, ask yourself, will this matter in 5 years? Or even, how might I view this situation with the wisdom of age? This temporal distance often reveals what feels catastrophic in the moment is actually manageable in the bigger picture. So there's also negativity bias and your legacy. That's this podcast, right? As we think about becoming ancestors worth remembering, negativity bias takes on another dimension. The stories we tell about our lives and the stories others will tell about us are shaped by what we notice, what we emphasize, and what we act upon. When we allow negativity bias to dominate, we risk creating a legacy defined by fear rather than courage, by what we avoided rather than by what we built. The most admired ancestors aren't those who never faced adversity. They're the ones who maintained perspective through challenges, who found opportunity within difficulty. Think about the elders in your own life who have made the greatest impact, family members or not. Chances are they weren't perfect optimists. Rather, they likely possessed what psychologists call tragic optimism, the ability to maintain hope and meaning even while acknowledging suffering and loss. This balanced perspective is what allows humans to transform adversity into wisdom. As we practice managing our own negativity bias, we're not just improving our daily experience, we're shaping how we'll be remembered. We're cultivating the capacity to see both the shadow and the light, and to choose our focus intentionally rather than reactively. We need that self awareness. So, to recap what we've covered today, negativity bias is a natural evolutionary adaptation that helped our ancestors survive by paying extra attention to threats. In our modern context, this same adaptation can lead us to overly negative experiences, creating distorted perceptions of reality. This bias affects everything from how we consume media to how we maintain relationships to how we evaluate ourselves. It keeps us in a state of low grade threat detection that takes a toll on both mental and physical health. But with awareness and practice, we can counterbalance this tendency by consciously savoring positive experiences, cultivating gratitude, reframing challenges, and curating our information diet. We can develop a more balanced perspective, one that acknowledges both difficulties and possibilities. I invite you to try just one of the strategies that we discussed today for the next week. Notice what shifts in your perception when you actively counter your brain's negative leap, and get back to us. Comment on social media, comment on the podcast. But before we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust to become one of our greatest teachers of resilience. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Your negativity bias is the stimulus. Your awareness creates the space. What will you choose in that space? That choice is your legacy in the making. Thanks for tuning in to Older But Stronger. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might benefit. Uh, Call me up if you need some extra coaching on this stuff. And remember to follow us for more insights on becoming an ancestor worth remembering. Until next time, may you notice the full spectrum of your experience, both the challenges that strengthen you and the joys that sustain you. Stay gorgeous. Okay. Once again, the negativity bias, why we focus on the bad, and how to shift our perspective.